The night covering the forests of North America was quiet and calm, as it always happens away from major cities. The darkness seemed thick and impenetrable. Only the silvery light of the moon made its way through the fog, lying in soft spots on the ground. There was something comforting about this solitude, something that Liam had long been used to seeing as a part of his life. Working as a wildlife photographer, he was often on such outings, waiting for the perfect shot hidden in the night shadows of the forest. He was looking for the tranquility and harmony of nature without human intervention, without the hustle and bustle of megacities. But this night, the silence was deceptive. Liam was sitting on the hillside, holding a camera in his hands, when he noticed something strange. In the distance beyond the tree line, a bright light suddenly cut. It was something unusual, not like the light of an airplane or stars. It was moving fast, accelerating by the second, and suddenly a bright flash lit up the entire horizon. Liam froze. Whatever it was, it clearly had nothing to do with the usual flights over forests. There was a low rumble in the air, which quickly turned into a deafening roar. Then the fall began. The ship, if you could call it that, broke through the sky and crashed into the ground with a deafening roar, scattering debris and raising a huge cloud of dust into the air. The forest vibrated as if the earth was trying to digest the impact. Liam instinctively jumped to his feet, watching as an unknown object hit the ground just a few miles away. His heart was pounding faster, and he felt a strange mixture of fear and curiosity. What was that? A plane? Space debris? A meteorite? But something inside him told him that it was something else. Liam quickly gathered up his equipment and rushed towards the crash site. He couldn't explain what exactly drew him there. Perhaps it was his journalistic flair, the opportunity to film something rare and unusual. Or maybe it's just curiosity, which always pushes people towards the unknown. But as he approached the crash site, he began to realize that he would encounter something much stranger than he could have imagined. As he got closer, the forest began to change. The air was filled with the smell of burnt metal and smoke, and a suffocating cloud of gray ash hung over the trees. There was an unusual silence around him. The birds had fallen silent, the insects had disappeared. It seemed that the forest itself was silent in anticipation, watching what was happening with some ancient fear of the unknown. Approaching the edge of the clearing, Liam saw what was clearly a spaceship. In a huge crater opened by the impact lay a half-burned structure resembling a fragment of something larger. Huge metal plates were torn apart like paper, surrounded by ash and sparks that had not yet been extinguished after the disaster. The wreckage was everywhere, parts of the ship, pieces of material unknown to him, which clearly had not been made on Earth. It was something alien as if the universe itself had thrown part of its mystery onto the Earth. Liam froze, not knowing how to react. There was something in front of him that clearly could not exist in the familiar framework of his world. But it wasn't the crash itself that caught his attention, but the movement among the debris. There was someone in the depths of the wreckage. Slowly came closer, trying to move cautiously. It seemed to him that every step he took might be his last. The ship was still emitting humming sounds as if processes were going on somewhere inside it that Liam did not understand. Electric discharges sparkled in the distance, creating the feeling that it could all be about to explode. But then he saw her. At first it was just a vague movement, like a shadow against the background of burning debris. Liam stopped, holding his breath, when he noticed that a figure was climbing out from under one of the rubble. It was something or someone he wasn't sure yet. The creature rose, staggering, as if surprised to find itself alive. The figure was tall, slender, and clearly not human. Her skin shone in the dim light of the sparks with a strange bluish hue, and her eyes, huge and bottomless, seemed to shimmer, reflecting the light of the surrounding lights. The creature was injured, and it was obvious. There were cuts and burns on his body, and one of his sides was covered in blood, a strange silver color that seemed too thick for earthly blood. Liam couldn't take his eyes off her face. It was a woman, alien, but at the same time incredibly graceful and beautiful in her strangeness. She was struggling to stay on her feet, and Liam, giving in to instinct, took a step towards her, ready to help. Even though there was a creature in front of him that he had never seen, his inner sense did not allow him to stay away. He approached slowly, without saying a word, but his gaze said everything. She noticed him too and froze, looking at him as if she was studying him. assessing whether there was a threat or not. Their eyes met, and at that moment, Liam felt a strange connection, something more than simple curiosity or compassion. He slowly raised his hands, indicating that he was not threatening. His voice was quiet and soothing when he spoke.
"You're hurt. I want to help."
Her eyes widened and she tilted her head as if she didn't fully understand his words, but something in his tone calmed her down. She didn't move, but Liam felt that she gave him the opportunity to get closer. He took another step closer, his heart pounding so hard it seemed like it could burst out of his chest. Her breathing was fast and ragged, but she didn't try to resist. Finally, he got close enough to touch her hand, and at that moment he felt the warmth of her skin. It was a strange, indescribable feeling, as if her body radiated not only warmth, but also some kind of energy. Her gaze met his again, and although neither of them understood the other's language, there was no need for words in this silent communication. Their connection, although it began at the time of the disaster, was real and tangible. Liam slowly put his arm around her shoulders, helping her to stand on her feet. She was weak, her body trembling with pain and fatigue. He carefully guided her past the wreckage, trying to get her out of the danger zone as soon as possible. Their every move was steeped in caution and tension, as if they were both aware of the fragility of the moment. When they finally left the wreck, Liam set her down on the ground and turned around to take another look at the wreck ship. He knew that in a few hours this place would be discovered, either by the authorities or by someone else, but he didn't have time to think. He turned to the alien, who was now sitting leaning on a rock. Her eyes were closed, and her breathing had become more regular. Sat down next to her, feeling strangely relieved that at least part of this disaster was over. But a feeling of something more began to arise inside him. Who is she? Why did her ship crash? And what should we do next? He looked at her alien but amazingly beautiful face, and realized that his life would never be the same again. There was silence in the forest thicket, but it did not bring peace. Instead, the air was saturated with tension, as if nature itself was aware that something strange and incomprehensible had happened here, an event that had disrupted the usual order of things. Liam felt it as keenly as everyone else around him. He was sitting on the ground next to an alien who seemed to have lost her last strength after he took her out of the crash zone. Her eyes, closed at that moment, reminded him of the reflection of endless starry spaces, although now she looked fragile and vulnerable. Niraya's skin, although Liam didn't know her name yet, had a strange sheen as if the moonlight was reflecting off her body, but this sheen was muted, as if her strength was leaving her by the second. He felt it, but he didn't know what to do next. Liam looked around, trying to find an answer in this desolate forest. There were still columns of smoke rising from the wreck in the distance, and he knew they didn't have much time. If government services or someone else discovered the crash site, he and his mysterious companion could be in serious danger. His breathing was heavy, like after a long run, although in fact he was just sitting there trying to make sense of what was happening. In front of him lay a creature from another world, another reality. Never in his life could he have imagined that such a thing could happen to him. Everything he saw on the news, in movies, seemed like a distant fantasy, an impossible dream. But now there was a reality in front of him that he couldn't deny. Liam carefully got to his feet, looked at Niraya, and knelt down in front of her. Her breathing was weak, but still regular. He didn't know if she was conscious, but he intuitively felt that she was aware of his presence.
"Maester, can you hear me?"
Liam said softly, as if he was afraid to scare her off. His voice was almost a whisper. Her eyes twitched slightly, and her eyelids opened slightly. Liam froze, not knowing how to interpret her reaction. There was a mixture of fatigue and pain in her gaze, but at the same time some kind of quiet understanding. They stared at each other for several long moments, and for the first time Liam realized how different she was from everything he knew. It was something that could not be explained in words. Her unusual beauty and strange vulnerability combined in a single image. He held out his hand slowly and carefully, as if afraid that it might evaporate like a mirage. His fingers touched her skin. It felt warmer than he expected and slightly rough, as if covered with small scales that trembled under his fingers. But at the same time, her skin was soft and delicate, like a human's. She didn't push away his touch. Her eyes closed again, but her breathing became a little deeper, as if his touch gave her some kind of comfort. Liam felt that there was a strange but very strong bond between them. He didn't know exactly what that meant, but he felt he had to help her.
My friend, I do not know where you are from,
He said softly, keeping his hand on her shoulder.
but I will not leave you here.
He examined her, trying to figure out how best to help her. Her clothes, if you could call them clothes, were something like a film, tightly fitting her body like a second skin, but now this film has been damaged, torn in several places. Liam noticed a strange shimmering blood that was slowly trickling down her skin, leaving behind shiny traces. He needed to act quickly. He took off his jacket and covered her shoulders, trying to protect her from the night cold. She moved a little again. Her eyelids fluttered, but she didn't try to resist. Liam turned around and looked at the steaming horizon. He knew that time was short and all he could do was get her out of here as quickly as possible. But where to? The house was far away, and the road through the forest would take several hours, if not more. However, he couldn't leave her here. For the first time in a long time, he felt that his actions really mattered. He had to help her, if only because it was the right thing to do. He felt responsible for her life, for her safety, even if he couldn't explain it in words. Liam gently hugged Naraya. Lifting her into his arms, she turned out to be lighter than he expected, as if her body was devoid of the usual human mass. He could feel her breathing getting a little faster, but she didn't make a sound. Her head was resting on his chest, and he could feel the warmth of her body through his clothes. The forest was quiet, too quiet, as if nature itself was watching their actions, as if trying to comprehend the presence of an unearthly being in its domain. Liam moved carefully, trying not to upset this delicate balance. He knew that the slightest noise could attract unnecessary attention. Walking through the dense forest, Liam held Naraya tightly but carefully. Her breathing became a little more regular, but it was still heavy. He knew she needed treatment, and the sooner the better. The moon shone through the trees, its light reflected on the alien's body, giving her skin a mystical, almost magical shade. Liam couldn't help but notice her unusual beauty, but what struck him most was her fragility. He knew that this was a creature from another planet, perhaps with a much more advanced civilization. But at that moment, she seemed to him as defenseless as any person in trouble. Finally, he reached his car, parked at the edge of the forest. Opening the back door, he carefully placed Naraya in the back seat. Her eyes opened again, and she looked at him with quiet gratitude. It was only for a moment, but there was something in her gaze that made Liam feel like they were starting to understand each other, despite all the barriers between their worlds. Liam got behind the wheel, started the car, and drove away from the crash site. He knew that he had to take her to a safe place, away from the eyes of those who might be interested in her appearance. It seemed to him that it was only a matter of time before the authorities began to investigate the mysterious crash. But right now, his main goal was clear: to protect her no matter what. The journey home was long and stressful. Liam was constantly looking back in the mirror, checking her condition. Naraya was lying quietly. Her eyes were closed, but he could see that she was alive. Her chest was slowly rising and falling, as if she was in a state of deep sleep. When they finally reached his house, hidden in the woods, Liam felt some relief. He knew they wouldn't be found here right away. The house was remote enough to avoid unnecessary questions. He carefully carried her out of the car and carried her inside. In the living room, he laid her carefully on the sofa, covering her with a blanket he found nearby. Liam sat down next to her, looking at her. He realized that his life had changed in an instant when he saw the falling ship. There was a mystery in front of him that he couldn't solve, but it didn't matter now. The main thing was that he felt responsible for her. How strange. A few hours ago, he was living the ordinary, predictable life of a photographer, and now there was an alien in his house in need of help. Naraya was his first encounter with something unearthly, but this encounter was not just with an extraterrestrial being. It was something more personal. She was the beginning of something bigger than he could have imagined. Liam sat next to her for a long time, listening to her even breathing, and without understanding how, began to feel something more than just curiosity about her. For the first time in his life, he realized that he had met someone who would change him forever. Liam's house, located deep in the woods, was a secluded world in its own way, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. He often considered the secluded corner a salvation, a place where he could forget about the pressure of the outside world and focus on what he really liked: photography and exploring nature. But now, the house, which had always seemed like a peaceful refuge to him, had become something more. He turned into a shelter where Niraya was located, an alien who fell to Earth from distant stars. This house, with its quiet walls and the smell of wood, became their only safe place in an unfamiliar world. Liam led her through the threshold, felt the weight of her body in his arms. She was still weak, her breathing was ragged, but she held on. Her strange, soft skin, glowing with a slight blue hue, seemed almost ethereal. Her twinkling eyes, which were now closed, left the impression of something unattainable, but at the same time fragile. At that moment, he couldn't think of anything but finding a way to help her recover. Liam laid Niraya on the sofa in the living room, carefully covering her with a warm blanket. She lay motionless, her chest rising and falling slowly, her breathing a little more regular than before, but still heavy. There was no expression of pain on her face, but Liam felt that she had exhausted her strength and every breath was difficult for her. He sat down on the edge of the sofa, watching her condition, not knowing what to do next. He was aware that this was a creature from another planet, an alien life form, and he had no idea about its biology or needs. She had wounds that he could have treated with simple earthly means, but he was afraid that his intervention might do more harm than good. Liam understood that the alien nature of Niraya posed obstacles to him that he had never encountered before. He spent several hours sitting next to her, checking on her condition, giving her time to rest. When the night finally came into its own, Liam decided that she needed to dress her wounds, despite all the risks. He gathered up the first aid kit he kept in the bathroom, pulled out bandages and antiseptics, returned to the couch and carefully knelt in front of her. Her body was covered with, strange cuts and burns, traces of the disaster. His gaze lingered on a strange substance that resembled blood, but had a shimmering, silvery hue. It didn't look like human blood, but he felt that her wounds needed treatment. He carefully began to wash the cuts and apply bandages to the damaged areas. His every gesture was as careful and circumspect as possible. Her body reacted to his touch with a slight shudder, but Niraya did not open her eyes. Liam felt that she was in a state of deep rest, as if her body was recovering from injuries on its own. The process looked unfamiliar and mysterious, but he felt that his help was important. A few days passed, and Niraya stayed at Liam's house, recuperating. He continued to take care of her, checking on her condition every day. He watched her breathing, the changes in her body temperature as she gradually regained consciousness. Niraya spent most of her time in a state of sleep or drowsiness, as if her body required maximum rest. Liam was in constant anxiety, realizing that her life depended on his actions. He did not know what exactly this creature needed to recover, and could only hope that his earthly means would be at least somewhat effective. But it wasn't just concern for her physical condition that occupied his thoughts. The time spent with Niraya in this secluded house changed his inner perception. Liam increasingly felt a strange but deep connection to her. It wasn't just curiosity or a desire to help an alien creature. It was something more personal, something he couldn't put into words. Every movement she made, every breath she took, tied him to her. He didn't understand why, but he felt that there was more than just physical intimacy between them. One day, as Liam was sitting at the kitchen table, as usual, watching the morning light coming through the curtains, he heard a slight rustling behind him. Turning around, he saw that Niraya had got up from the sofa and was now standing in the doorway, leaning against the wall. Her eyes were slightly open and there was no previous weakness in them. She looked better, but still tired. He got up from his seat and walked over to her, placing his hand gently on her shoulder, ready to help her lie down again.
Master, can you move already?
He said softly, his voice full of concern. Niraya didn't answer, but a look of gratitude appeared on her face. Her lips tightened, but she didn't say a word. It was the only moment Liam realized how deep her wound was, not only physically, but also emotionally. She was far from her home, far from her world, and this pain was much more than the wounds on her body. Liam helped her to a chair by the window where they sat in silence for a while. He was looking at her face, which now looked more relaxed, despite all the tension of the situation. Her unusual eyes, which seemed bottomless, studied the space around her. It wasn't her world, it wasn't her home, but she didn't look like a stranger here anymore. Every morning, Liam tried to leave food on the table for Naraya, realizing that her body might need nourishment, but he wasn't sure which products would suit her. On the third day after her recovery, she finally touched the food offered, a piece of bread and water. It was a simple set, but he saw her carefully picking up the bread, examining it as if this piece of bread was something mysterious to her. She ate a little and Liam felt relieved, realizing that perhaps his attempts to feed her were not in vain. Her every gesture, every movement seemed to him beautiful and unusual. Despite her obvious physical weakness, Naraya retained amazing grace and strength. Liam couldn't help but admire her fortitude, her determination. This creature from another planet was as vulnerable as he was, but her inner dignity amazed him. Her recovery lasted for several weeks. Liam watched every change carefully, trying to do his best to help her. They still didn't talk much. Their communication was quiet, consisted of a glance, a touch, a fleeting gesture, but it was enough. There was an involuntary understanding between them that did not need words. They became closer, although each remained in his shell. One night, when deep darkness reigned outside the windows, Liam woke up from a strange feeling. He got out of bed and went into the living room. Naraya was standing by the window, her eyes fixed on the stars. It was her first conscious movement after a long period of recovery. Her silhouette in the moonlight looked almost ethereal, and in this light her eyes twinkled as if they reflected the starry sky. She stood motionless, as if listening to distant cosmic sounds that Liam couldn't hear. He came closer, feeling that this was a moment of special importance. Although he did not know what the gesture meant, Liam stood next to her, following her gaze. The sky was clear and cloudless, dotted with thousands of stars. Liam realized that somewhere among these stars was her home, her world which she had lost in the crash. And although they were both silent, he felt her longing and pain without needing an explanation. Their silent intimacy became more and more palpable. He felt that their fates were now inextricably linked, despite all the differences. Liam gently touched her arm, and she didn't recoil as she had at first. Now her touch was warmer, and Liam felt that something more than just a temporary intimacy had grown between them. It was a bond that became stronger every day. A few more weeks passed, and life in Liam's house gradually began to find a rhythm. Naraya has fully recovered. Her wounds had healed, although the traces of the crash still remained on her body in the form of thin lines. But her inner strength returned. She no longer needed outside help, although Liam continued to take care of her. Now they lived together in peace and harmony. Their lives were full of a silent understanding that did not require words. It's been a few months since Naraya appeared in Liam's life, like a fallen star from the far edge of the universe. Her recovery had been long and difficult, but now that she had regained her powers, their lives began to take a strange but steady shape. Liam and Naraya lived side by side, in silence, where every gesture and every movement said more than any words. Despite the fact that they did not communicate in the language familiar to Liam, there was a subtle understanding between them, something that can be called the beginning of a feeling, albeit quiet but deeply felt. At first, Liam didn't even realize how his perception of Naraya began to change. He still saw her as a mysterious, almost mythical creature whose nature remained a mystery to him. But every day his thoughts returned more and more to her. It was more than just taking care of her physical condition. He began to notice in her not only an unusual appearance or alien features, but also something deeply human, which gradually captured his mind and heart. When Naraya was weak and defenseless, Liam perceived her as a kind of miracle, as an earthly being who needed protection. But now that her body had recovered and her movements had regained that lightness and grace, he began to notice other, more subtle moments. She was graceful like a wildcat, and her every step was filled with extraordinary smoothness and precision. It attracted him more and more. He couldn't take his eyes off the way her body moved, how she deftly handled the simplest earthly things, learning the basics of human life from him. But there was something else that made his heart beat faster, something that had nothing to do with her appearance or even her alien nature. It was her inner strength. hidden behind her outer fragility. Liam saw how she coped with loneliness, with her isolation from the world that was familiar to her. She never complained, never showed weakness. Her silent determination, her ability to adapt to a new world without any resistance or fear, all this made her even more attractive to him. The days of their life together became saturated with this unspoken intimacy. They had joint rituals, simple and uncomplicated, but filled with meaning. Liam cooked the food, leaving a portion for Niraya, and she, for her part, often silently watched his actions, studying his human habits. Sometimes she went outside with him when he went to take pictures of nature. Liam could feel her presence behind him as she stood in the distance, watching him work with the camera. One day, Liam noticed how Niraya touched his equipment for the first time. She walked over to the table where the camera lay, carefully, as if it were something sacred, and touched the lens. Her fingers were light and careful, as if she was afraid of breaking this fragile human instrument. Liam watched her from afar, not interfering, allowing her to study a new subject for her. This touch, so gentle and caring, made his heart clench. At that moment, he realized that there was a connection between them that could not be described in ordinary words. She studied Liam's world with the same attention as he studied hers. And this attention, this subtle mutual care, became the basis for the feeling that gradually began to flare up inside him. Liam began to realize that his affection for Niraya had outgrown the simple desire to protect her. It became something much bigger, something that rose from the depths of his soul and filled his every thought. At first, he tried to fight this feeling, convincing himself that it was impossible. How could anyone fall in love with a creature that was so far from his understanding? How could anyone feel something so strong for a creature that came from another planet? But the more he tried to resist, the stronger his emotions became. This feeling took hold of him slowly but inexorably, penetrating into his every gesture, every thought, every movement. One day, when Liam woke up early in the morning, he found Niraya standing at the window, looking at the stars. It had become a habit for her to spend her nights contemplating the distant sky that had once been her home. But something changed that night. Liam walked up to her, stopping a few steps away. She didn't turn around, but he sensed that she was aware of his presence. The moonlight coming through the windows illuminated her figure, giving her an almost ghostly appearance. Her shimmering skin, which had always reminded him of her alien nature, now seemed almost native. He couldn't take his eyes off her silhouette, the way the light reflected on her hair, on her skin, on her hands, which she slowly raised to touch the glass. She stood as if she were trying to reach for the stars, as if her heart still belonged to that distant world she had lost. But Liam knew that wasn't the case anymore. She became a part of his world, a part of his life. He saw how her inner struggle subsided, how she adapted to the new reality. And at that moment, he realized that he was not just attached to her, but in love with her. This discovery was both frightening and overwhelming. Liam couldn't imagine how they could be together. They belonged to different worlds, different universes, but his feelings were too strong to ignore. It was something that was beyond logic and reason. This was what bound their souls together, despite all the obstacles. Every day, Liam realized more and more that he couldn't hide his feelings anymore. He noticed how his body was beginning to react differently to her presence. Now, when they accidentally touched each other, his heart skipped a beat and warmth spread through his body. These seemingly random touches were actually an expression of something deeper than a simple physical. More and more often, Liam found himself staring at her for longer than he should have. He began to notice little things, how her lips trembled slightly when she concentrated on something, how her eyes sparkled in the dim light, how her fingers moved as she studied something new for herself. These moments were imprinted in his mind, and he couldn't get rid of them. He was aware that his feelings for Niraya were not just attraction. It was something deeper. It was the desire to be with her, to protect her, to share her life, despite the impossibility of this union. At that moment, Liam realized that he couldn't imagine his life without her. She became an integral part of his existence for him. Every day he spent with her only intensified his feeling. He saw how Niraya began to perceive this world in a new way, how she adapted to earthly life. Her movements became more confident, Her face no longer expressed the pain and confusion that he had seen in the first days of their acquaintance. She was no longer an alien trapped in an alien world. She became a part of this world, a part of his life. Liam often wondered if Naraya felt the same way. He couldn't tell exactly what was going on in her soul, but her gestures, her looks, her silence told him that there was more between them than just friendship or mutual support. It was love, though strange, unusual, but as real as any other. One day, when they were sitting together on the porch of the house, Liam felt Naraya move slightly closer to him. It had been a few months since Naraya had appeared in Liam's life, and their world, which they now lived in together, seemed stable. They were far from prying eyes, far from cities where any oddities or deviations from the norm could attract unwanted attention. The solitude of the forest gave them a sense of security, as if everything that happened outside their small world had nothing to do with them. But the calm that seemed eternal began to slowly erode. Like nature itself, Liam and Naraya felt that the balance was starting to break. Something had changed, something invisible but persistent penetrated into their lives, forcing both creatures to look at the horizon more and more often with an unconscious sense of anxiety. Drones flying over the forest, which Liam did not immediately pay attention to. In his world, they were used by scientists and researchers to track natural processes. However, something about these drones was strange. They flew too low, as if they were specifically looking for something in the wilderness. For the first time in a long time, Liam felt a chill of fear creep up his spine as soon as he realized that they could be the beginning of something bigger. Liam decided to keep his suspicions to himself, not wanting to alarm Naraya, although his inner anxiety was growing every day. Her calmness was something sacred to him. Her adaptation to life on Earth and their budding love became the most important thing in his life. He was afraid to destroy this fragile Adele by reminding her that the danger could still be real. He continued to observe the drones, but did not report his concerns, hoping that this was a temporary phenomenon and it would pass. However, after a few days, other oddities began to occur in the forest. Helicopters were increasingly crossing the sky above them, not the ones used for rescue operations, but clearly military ones. Their hum became more frequent, and Liam noticed their trajectory. They explored the forest area too thoroughly, as if they were looking for something. It was clear to him that someone had begun to show interest in the area where the disaster with Naraya's ship had occurred. Although the crash site had long been hidden and carefully camouflaged by nature, Liam felt that those who were now there were not casual observers. One of the key moments was the day Liam returned from the city with a small supply of provisions. Everything was as usual until he noticed a parked car on the narrow road leading to his house. It was nothing remarkable at first glance. Maybe one of the tourists got lost or one of the local farmers came fishing. But the way the car was parked and the fact that it was full of people immediately alerted Liam. A group of people, obviously not local, were standing by the car, checking some devices. Their faces were tense and their movements were precise and purposeful. He froze in the shade of the trees, watching as they consulted a map or some kind of screen, discussing something. All their actions, their business acumen left no doubt. These were not random tourists. They were obviously looking for something. When one of the men took out a camera and began photographing the forest, Liam realized that their interest was not directed at nature or landscapes. They were scanning the area. They were looking for something specific. When they moved towards the forest, he barely managed to hiding in the dense thickets. His heart was pounding in his chest, and he knew that everything was serious now. These people were clearly connected with government structures. Perhaps they found out about the crash. Perhaps these were search teams collecting data about the fallen object. Liam didn't know how long they would be here, but he knew that this was no longer just a casual visit. These people will most likely come back and explore the area again. They could have used drones, thermal imagers, or some other devices to find traces of the alien ship. He felt that they didn't have much time. That evening, Liam was preoccupied with gloomy thoughts. Naraya, still unaware of what was happening, was in the house. She didn't notice the oddities because this whole world was alien to her. Every day was an exploration of a new environment for her, and she seemed to trust Liam completely, believing that he would be able to protect her from any threats. But Liam knew he couldn't hide reality from her any longer. He continued to keep an eye on what was happening in the forest. In the following days, he ran into various groups of people several times, all of whom were clearly not equipped for an ordinary walk through the forest. People walked around with detectors, carefully studied every piece of land, looked into devices that Liam could not recognize. They were getting closer and closer to the part of the forest where his house was located. One day he noticed footprints on the ground near the border of his property, traces of heavy machinery, as if someone had come here at night. Although none of these visitors showed up at his house during the day, Liam knew that the situation was getting more dangerous. They could appear at any time, and then there would be no way to escape. He began to think about how to protect Niraya. Her presence could not be explained by any rational arguments. If she is discovered, it will not only jeopardize her safety, but also cause irreversible consequences. Liam understood that she would become an object of study, maybe even violence. She could have been taken to closed laboratories. She could have been tortured or tested. He couldn't let that happen. As Liam lay awake one night listening to the silence of the forest, he felt the roar of helicopters approaching. These were not the rare patrols that sometimes circled over the forest. This sound was more purposeful, and it was getting louder by the moment. Liam jumped out of bed, ran outside, and froze, looking at the sky. The helicopters were low, too low, and they were moving straight towards his house. He realized that this was not a random patrol. They were getting closer because they knew there was something here. There was no time to waste. Liam knew that his only chance now was to act quickly. He rushed back into the house. Time was playing against them. There was only one thought throbbing in his head. He had to save Niraya. Liam knew that if he didn't take decisive action now, they would be discovered. He opened the garage door, grabbed his belongings needed to leave the house, and began hastily packing up everything he might need. The car was his only chance of a quick escape. Niraya could hide in the forest, but it was too risky. Helicopters could easily spot her from a height, and thermal imagers could detect her even through dense vegetation. They needed to get as far away as possible and as fast as possible. The forest was their only protection. The moment Liam and Niraya disappeared into the trees, the darkness of the forest enveloped them like a protective blanket. Liam could feel the adrenaline pumping in every step, and his heart was pounding so loudly that it seemed as if the sound could be heard by his pursuers. However, despite all his anxiety, he couldn't afford to stop. Niraya ran beside him, her movements smooth, almost weightless despite the severity of their situation. She knew they were being followed, even if she didn't know all the details. Their instincts told them that the time for making a decision was approaching. They raced deeper and deeper into the forest, moving away from the house that had been their refuge for the past months. Liam never thought that he would have to leave this place so familiar and expensive. But right now, all that mattered was Niraya's safety. Her unearthly nature became not only a miracle for him, but also a major threat. They ran along a narrow forest path without looking back, but Liam knew they were being hunted. They were surrounded by darkness and the tranquility of nature, but helicopters were inexorably circling overhead, like blackbirds that could not be seen through the crowns of the trees. They didn't give up. Liam knew that these thermal imaging machines could detect them even in the thick of the forest. But at the moment of flight, all his concentration was focused on getting as far away as possible. They reached the hillside that Liam knew like the back of his hand. He spent years in these forests studying nature, photographing wild animals, and living in complete harmony with the world around him. But now nature was no longer calm and serene as before. She became the last barrier between him, Niraya, and those who pursued them. When they reached the top of the hill, Liam stopped, trying to catch his breath. He looked back over his shoulder, hoping that they had escaped far enough. But his hopes were ephemeral. Through the trees, he could see the dim flicker of light from helicopters circling over the forest, and their sounds now sounded a little closer than before. The persecution did not stop, and every moment of delay could cost them their freedom. Niraya stood nearby, her breathing steady, but her eyes glowing in the dim moonlight reflected anxiety. Her alien nature gave her a strange calmness, but Liam could see that she was aware of the danger. Although her face remained impassive, her movements became more and more cautious. It wasn't just fear, It was a conscious struggle for survival. They continued on their way. Liam led her towards the old shelter he had known since childhood. It was an abandoned forest structure that once served as a hunting lodge. It was deep in the forest, far from the paths known to people. They might not be found there, at least for a while, to develop a plan for further action. Liam knew that this shelter would not be able to protect them for long, but now it was their only chance. They made their way through the dense vegetation. Branches whipped at their faces, but they didn't stop. The forest, which had always been Liam's home and source of inspiration, had now turned into a maze in which they were forced to hide like wild animals. This place, which had always given him a sense of freedom, was now their last line of defense. Every step deeper into the forest was a step towards salvation, but with every step, Liam realized that their hiding place here was a temporary solution. By the time they finally reached the abandoned cabin, the night had already fully taken over. It was dark and quiet inside. Liam lit the small lamp they had brought with them, and a soft light flooded the room. The house was simple and modest: wooden walls, old floors covered with moss. There were no amenities here, but what they needed most was shelter. Naraya sat down on a rough wooden chair, her eyes fixed on the space in front of her. Her breathing was still steady, but Liam could see that a storm was raging in her heart. He looked at her, trying to figure out what she might be feeling. She was an alien, a creature from another planet, whose nature and perception of the world were completely different. But during their time together, Liam learned to recognize subtle emotions that she didn't express in words. He could feel her anxiety about the future. She, like him, understood that their lives would not be the same anymore. They couldn't stay in the forest anymore. Helicopters, search teams, all this indicated that their time was running out here. Naraya could no longer hide in the shadows of this world, but it meant that their only chance was to make a decision that seemed unthinkable. Liam moved to the window, looking out at the forest, which was plunged into the darkness of the night. He was thinking about what to do now. They could run further beyond the forest, beyond the country. But wherever they are, Naraya will always be in danger. Her alien nature did not allow her to hide among humans. He knew that her life on Earth would never be safe. The authorities, researchers, the military, they will all want to study it, get its power, perhaps use it for their own purposes. Liam couldn't let her become the subject of someone else's experiments. But what then? What was their way out? Various thoughts flashed through Liam's mind. He could help her get back to her planet if that was possible. But their chances of doing so were minimal. The ship was destroyed, and they had neither the means nor the technology to restore interstellar travel. Liam was aware that Naraya had stayed here forever, and with each realization of this fact, his heart, they could try to stay, to hide. But maybe running away is not the answer. Perhaps they needed to find another way, stay here, accept the circumstances, and try to resist fate. The night dragged on for a long time. Liam couldn't sleep. His mind was preoccupied with the future. He didn't know what to do next, but he knew one thing for sure. He didn't want to lose Naraya. She became something more to him than just an alien rescued from a space disaster. She became a part of his life, his world. Their bond, which arose in these difficult circumstances, was real, deep, and strong. He couldn't leave her. She was his love. Liam realized that their love was impossible in the usual sense of the word. She was too unusual, too far from what he knew and understood before, but it didn't matter now. He couldn't imagine his life without Naraya, and he knew he wouldn't let anyone take her away from him. When morning came and the first rays of light broke through the dense clouds, Liam finally came to a decision. He knew that they would not be able to escape from their pursuers, but they would be able to resist. They will stay here, and they will find a way to protect themselves. It was their decision not to run, but to stay, accept the world they had created for themselves, and fight for it. Liam got up, went to the window, and looked out at the forest they called home. This forest, these trees, it was their shelter, their world, and they will stay here despite all the difficulties.